Deep in the concrete corridors of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, a room of colonels, generals, and operations analysts stared at the screens broadcasting CNN. For days, they had watched the coalition buildup. Satellites had reported the flow of American armor into Saudi Arabia, the arrival of carrier battle groups, the mobilization of British, French, and even Arab forces. But what they saw now was something they weren't prepared for. The war had already begun, and it was nothing like what they expected. There were no rolling tank battles, no infantry surges, no artillery barrages blanketing the desert. Instead, the screen flickered with footage of bombs slamming into power stations, radar domes collapsing in fire, and Iraqi bunkers disintegrating beneath perfectly guided explosions. There was no warning, no engagement, no resistance. In a war planned along their own lines, layered defenses, centralized command, armored belts, the entire Iraqi military, built on a mirror of their own doctrine, was being erased before it could respond. The air was supposed to be contested. It wasn't. The radar was supposed to warn of attack. It didn't. The tanks were supposed to hold the line. They never even saw the enemy. In the control center of Soviet Air Defense Command, an Air Force general leaned forward and muttered to his aide, "This isn't war. This is extermination." For decades, Soviet military doctrine had prepared for mass confrontation, armies clashing in Europe, formations bleeding each other until the strongest survived. But what they saw in the deserts of Kuwait and southern Iraq wasn't attrition. It was surgical annihilation. Soviet officers tried to justify it. Maybe the Iraqis were incompetent. Maybe they didn't apply doctrine correctly. Maybe the Americans had simply gotten lucky. But the footage kept coming. Missile batteries struck before they launched. T-72 seconds destroyed at night from 30,000 feet. Entire command posts silenced before commanders gave orders. It wasn't randomness, it was a system, a new kind of war. And for Soviet command, it was the first time they truly froze, not because they didn't have a response, but because they no longer understood the rules. The enemy had changed the game. And now, Soviet doctrine was obsolete on arrival. For nearly half a century, Soviet military doctrine had been built on one central truth. Mass wins wars. Massive armies, massive armor columns, massive firepower. The Red Army's success in World War II had been forged not by finesse but by scale. In the post-war years, that legacy calcified into operational theology, one studied, replicated, and exported across the globe. By the 1,980 seconds, Iraq had adopted that very doctrine wholesale. The Iraqi army fielded over 4,000 tanks, many Soviet T-55 seconds, T-62 seconds, and T-72 seconds. Its air defense was multi-layered, combining radar-guided missiles, gun batteries, and mobile launchers, modeled on the Soviet Warsaw Pact template. Their infantry tactics mirrored Red Army manuals, heavily dug in, reinforced with artillery, and structured for attritional defense. And in Soviet war rooms, the assumption held, no air campaign alone could dismantle a force this entrenched. This was the first wrong assumption. Soviet generals believed air power could harass, delay, soften but never destroy the core of a modern military. Ground combat, especially armored breakthroughs, was still viewed as the decisive factor. The second wrong assumption was psychological. They believed no military would dare initiate a campaign without a long preparatory phase, weeks of build-up, feints, and probing. This belief was rooted in their own planning. Soviet military theory emphasized shaping the battlefield before committing resources. Mass required momentum. So when Operation Desert Storm began with a thunderclap on the 17th of January 1991, without warning, without staged escalation, it violated everything they expected. Precision-guided munitions? They were still considered unreliable gimmicks in most Soviet circles. Stealth aircraft? A niche technology? Not a battlefield game-changer. Networked command and control? Useful in theory, but impractical in combat's chaos, according to Soviet doctrine. Yet by the end of the first night, 34 Iraqi air defense sites were destroyed. Command bunkers vanished. Communications severed. And most critically, Iraq's Soviet-style command hierarchy, centralized, top-down, was paralyzed. For Soviet strategists watching this unfold, the speed was incomprehensible. Their model of war revolved around attrition over time. The idea that a war might be won by attrition in hours, through targeted removal of system nodes rather than mass combat, had never been operationalized in their thinking. Iraq was supposed to hold. It didn't, and the assumptions collapsed one after the other. By the third day of the air campaign, the Soviet delegation in Baghdad had already begun quietly sending panicked dispatches back to Moscow. Their targeting is not random. They do not aim for troops, they aim for the brain. Soviet generals weren't just watching a war, they were watching the death of their doctrine, live on television. The Soviet Union's warfighting doctrine was born in the fires of World War II and refined across 4 decades of Cold War planning. Its essence could be summarized in a single phrase: deep operations. Massed armored formations were to punch through enemy lines, supported by artillery and layered air defense. Once through, they would exploit rear areas, encircle enemy forces, and grind down resistance through sheer weight of numbers. The doctrine emphasized shock, speed, and depth, but always through volume. Every Warsaw-Pact military exercise followed this logic. Frontline divisions prepared to hurl themselves westward through the Fulda Gap. Hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of tanks and vehicles, all moving in coordinated thrusts. Success was measured in kilometers advanced and bridges seized, not in communications disrupted or radars destroyed. But this doctrine had one fatal flaw. It assumed the battlefield would remain linear. It assumed the enemy would fight symmetrically with tank against tank, gun against gun, general against general. Air power was important, but not decisive. Electronic warfare was auxiliary, not central. Speed was physical, not digital. The Americans had been working on something different. It was called air-land battle. Formulated in the late 1970 seconds, air-land battle didn't just revise tactics, it reinvented how wars could be fought. Its central insight: war is no longer about lines, it's about networks. Disrupt the enemy's communications, and their divisions become deaf. Destroy logistics nodes, and their tanks can't move. Blind their radars, and their air defenses collapse. Air-land battle emphasized synchronization across all domains. Precision strikes would dismantle the enemy's rear and command centers before frontline units were even engaged. It was doctrine designed not to confront Soviet power, but to bypass and destroy it from within. In Soviet headquarters, it was dismissed as fantasy, too complex, too reliant on technology, too American. And then came Desert Storm. What Soviet planners watched unfold in Iraq wasn't just new, it was the full realization of a doctrine they had refused to believe in. Instead of lines, there were pressure points. Instead of fronts, there were targets. Instead of attrition, there was obliteration by precision. Iraqi divisions organized exactly as the Red Army would have instructed never got to maneuver. Their rear was cut before the front moved. Their artillery never fired in coordination. Their command posts were vaporized. In one of the many Soviet internal memos, a colonel described it bluntly: "They are not fighting the army. They are fighting its nervous system." Airland battle had taken the chessboard and turned it into circuitry. The game had changed. Soviet doctrine, once dominant, was now a blueprint for defeat. And in the desert, the proof was undeniable. It began at exactly 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time, the 17th of January 1991. Within minutes, the entire sky over Iraq came alive with streaks of motion, silent, precise, lethal. Coalition aircraft, over 700 of them, launched in coordinated waves from carriers, airbases, and forward staging grounds. But these weren't massed bombing raids from a bygone era. These were surgical strikes, and they moved faster than Soviet intelligence believed possible. By the time Baghdad's air raid sirens began to wail, it was already too late. On radar screens in both Baghdad and Moscow, command bunkers blinked off the map destroyed, not by chance, but by design. Iraqi Integrated Air Defense Command was the first to go, shattered by stealth fighters and cruise missiles before a single counter-order could be issued. Communications hubs were cut. Long-range SAM batteries were eliminated in pre-coordinated chains of attack. Every step of Iraq's layered defense, the very model developed by Soviet advisors, collapsed before it could function. The most impossible moment came 45 minutes into the campaign. Soviet advisors, stationed near H-2 Air Base in western Iraq, had spent months reinforcing its hardened aircraft shelters, concrete walls meters thick, Soviet-engineered revetments designed to withstand heavy bombardment. They watched in stunned silence as one bomb, a laser-guided GBU-27, punched through a shelter roof and detonated with pinpoint precision, destroying 2 MiG-29 seconds on the ground. The structure was intact. The planes were gone. The assumption that hardened defenses could withstand aerial attack had just died. The Soviets always believed that in order to dismantle a fortified system, one had to deploy an equally massive assault. The opening of Desert Storm disproved that in under an hour. There was no mass, just logic, speed, data. Elsewhere, mobile Scud launchers tried to relocate. AWACS aircraft detected the movement. J-Stars tracked it. F-15ES were dispatched. Minutes later, the targets were eliminated not with artillery, but with 500-pound bombs guided by invisible beams. To Soviet officers, this wasn't just warfare, it was science fiction. Never in their simulations had an enemy demonstrated the ability to disassemble a national air defense network before breakfast. In one intercepted Soviet message from Baghdad, a senior advisor wrote, "We are observing a form of battle we did not plan for. They strike, disappear, strike again. There is no front." The idea that a war could be started and a nation's defenses broken before the first tank moved was inconceivable under Soviet doctrine. But now it had happened. The first impossible event wasn't just what the Americans destroyed. It was that they didn't need to fight the army at all. They fought the systems around it, and won, before the defenders understood what was happening. In the first hours of the Gulf War, Soviet analysts scrambled to explain what they were seeing. Reports flooded in command centers erased, anti-air defenses suppressed, tank divisions frozen in place. Iraqi radar coverage had collapsed across entire sectors. No effective counterattacks were recorded. But inside Moscow's war rooms, disbelief took hold. It had to be a fluke, a show, a lucky opening round. Soviet doctrine had trained generations of officers to expect the fog of war, the chaotic, grinding unpredictability that gave even underpowered armies time to react. They believed in depth, in redundancy. No enemy, no matter how advanced, could maintain such pace and precision across days, let alone weeks. So when CNN broadcast footage of smart bombs diving into Baghdad's air ministry and exploding inside ventilation shafts, many assumed it was propaganda. Staged, exaggerated, edited. The real war, they believed, would reveal the usual chaos: missed targets, friendly fire, failed missions. But the chaos never came. Instead, day after day, the coalition campaign struck deeper. Iraqi fuel depots vanished. Fiber optic cables connecting air bases were severed. Ammunition dumps detonated spectacularly across the desert night, and Iraqi generals mirroring Soviet-style command structures found themselves blind, unable to communicate with frontline units or even each other. Moscow's reaction turned defensive. Official channels downplayed the damage. Soviet media reported coalition cowardice for using technology instead of manly confrontation. Internal memos within the Ministry of Defense suggested the Americans were too dependent on vulnerable systems. Some generals claimed the Iraqis would soon adapt, that the tide would turn once ground combat began. But privately, the tone shifted. One Soviet Air Force colonel, reviewing satellite photos of Al-Taqadum Air Base, noted in a classified memo. The Americans have not eliminated Iraq's air force. They have isolated it. The planes are alive but useless. This was new. Wars weren't supposed to be won by rendering enemies irrelevant. Wars were won by killing more, holding ground, outlasting the other side. Yet here was a doctrine that didn't need to occupy, it only needed to disconnect. A few Soviet officers warned of what this meant, that if the same tactics were used against a Warsaw Pact country, the results could be even more devastating. We rely on the same systems, one general admitted. The Americans know this. They are practicing. But the higher command still clung to an older view, that somehow this was Iraq's failure, not the Soviet Union's, that their doctrine had merely been misapplied. The idea that war had changed its shape was too dangerous to admit, and so Moscow hesitated. As the U.S. Air Force continued to operate freely, dismantling an entire army from the sky, Soviet strategists turned inward, searching for answers, blaming the wrong causes, refusing to see the future that had already arrived. By the second week of Desert Storm, it was clear that the U.S.-led coalition was not slowing down. Iraqi forces had lost over half their radar capacity. Their air force remained grounded, ammunition dumps were gone, fuel convoys cut, and SAM networks silenced. Soviet observers could no longer blame initial surprise, but they still clung to a theory. It was all because of total air superiority. In their minds, the Americans had simply overwhelmed the Iraqis from the air, a luxury no NATO force could expect in a true conflict with the Soviet Union. If we had parity in the air, one general insisted, none of this would have worked. Precision weapons are useless if the aircraft can't reach the target. This theory was comforting. It meant their own doctrine wasn't flawed, just situationally disadvantaged. The Iraqi failure wasn't a failure of Soviet design, but of environment. If the Americans hadn't controlled the sky, the war would have followed more traditional lines. But even this reasoning collapsed under scrutiny, because the key to the coalition's success wasn't just air dominance, it was how they used it. American aircraft weren't flying mass carpet-bombing missions like in Vietnam. They were executing interconnected, timed, and layered strikes. Each sortie was guided by real-time intelligence, supported by AWACS, satellites, and JSTARS systems. Planes communicated with ground observers and drones, and targets weren't chosen for their size, they were chosen for their place in the enemy's nervous system. This was something Soviet doctrine never considered. A war plan that didn't aim to destroy armies, but to nullify them. In one internal document from the KGB's Military Analysis Department, a striking conclusion was drawn. They are not attacking forces. They are attacking connections. Where we fight with divisions, they fight with algorithms. The technology mattered, yes, but what mattered more was the thinking behind it. Soviet planners had envisioned air power as tactical support for land offensives. What they watched in Iraq was air power functioning as a strategic scalpel cutting arteries, paralyzing responses, dismembering command before a single foot crossed the border. And that wasn't about air superiority. That was about system superiority. The wrong theory persisted in Moscow for a time, partly because admitting the truth meant rewriting decades of doctrine. It meant acknowledging that massive tank armies could be rendered obsolete not by other tanks, but by data, stealth, and timing. The U.S. wasn't just fighting Iraq, it was demonstrating, live and global, that precision had replaced mass. That networks now defeated numbers, and the Soviet Union, still counting tanks and divisions, still building massive formations, was watching itself in the mirror, and watching that mirror shatter when it became undeniable that American air power was dismantling Iraq's Soviet-modeled military machine. Soviet strategists pivoted to a second theory, one rooted not in systems or air superiority, but in human competence. They argued that Iraq failed because it lacked Soviet leadership. Yes, the tanks were Soviet. The missiles, the doctrine, the defensive layout, all of it modeled after Soviet textbooks. But, they insisted, The officers commanding them weren't trained in Moscow. The troops weren't motivated. The political system lacked the resilience of a true socialist military machine. The equipment doesn't fight on its own, one major general reportedly said behind closed doors. It requires discipline. It requires doctrine applied correctly. This theory had a reassuring simplicity. It protected the Soviet ego. It suggested that the tools weren't broken, only misused. But that illusion shattered the moment the Americans released combat footage. Not edited propaganda. Raw targeting tapes from laser-guided bombs. Video of a single F-117 slicing through 4 heavily defended sectors in one night, hitting hardened bunkers, slipping past SAM batteries, exiting undetected. Soviet officers had no answer. Not because they didn't understand the weapons, but because the structure of the battlefield had changed. This wasn't about Iraqi mistakes. It was about American transformation. Every critical Iraqi system that failed had been designed under Soviet guidance. Radar networks built in Soviet patterns. Tank battalions deployed using Soviet spacing, concealment, and defense in depth. Anti-air batteries positioned just as they would be along the Vistula or the Elbe. And yet, all of it fell apart, one after another. In one damning analysis circulated among senior Soviet defense officials, a colonel noted, "We are not watching Iraq fail. We are watching our own doctrine executed and destroyed." That report was quickly classified, because the implications were too dangerous to broadcast. If Soviet doctrine could be nullified by precision strikes and networked warfare, what hope would even a Soviet-led force have? Would the Red Army perform better? Perhaps. But would it withstand the same systemic dismantling? That was the question no one wanted to ask. Meanwhile, Iraq's most elite units, the Republican Guard, tried to regroup. They attempted textbook Soviet tactics, counter-maneuvering under cover of darkness, massing armor in defensive belts. American satellites spotted them. J-stars tracked them. A-10 seconds and F-15s hunted them down with precision. Even the best-trained, most disciplined Iraqi formations were wiped out before they saw the enemy. The idea that real Soviet forces would have prevailed began to look like wishful thinking. In fact, it started to look like denial. Because by February 1991, the facts were clear. This wasn't a failure of the Iraqi soldier. It was a death sentence for the Soviet model of war. And in Moscow, where entire military careers were built on that model, the walls began to close in. Behind the scenes in Soviet intelligence circles, panic began to settle into something more corrosive confusion. How had they missed this? For years, the KGB's military directorates, GRU field stations, and embassy-based observers had tracked American developments. They'd cataloged the rise of stealth aircraft, monitored tests of precision-guided munitions, intercepted U.S. defense budget increases. Dozens of field reports had warned of doctrinal shifts toward air-land battle. American training exercises like Reforger had revealed clues, unusual emphasis on coordination, real-time targeting, joint air-ground maneuvers, and yet, when the war began, nothing matched their expectations. The intelligence had all been there. What failed was interpretation. Soviet analysts had dismissed stealth as a limited innovation, assuming radar systems would eventually adapt. They had labeled precision bombs as cost-prohibitive novelties. They assumed real-time data links between aircraft, satellites, and command centers were too complex to function under combat conditions. These weren't technical oversights. They were doctrinal blind spots, the failure to imagine that the Americans weren't just building new tools, but an entirely new framework for war. And the GRU, tasked with understanding that framework, had failed utterly. Venom, their tracking operation for U.S. precision strike capabilities, focused mostly on airframes and missile types. It underestimated integration, the fusing of sensors, weapons, and planning into a single strike web. One declassified GRU summary from 1990 warned that U.S. Air Force assets might gain moderate advantages in first strike flexibility, but concluded such effects would be limited by redundancy in Warsaw Pact defense architecture. That assumption evaporated in the desert. U.S. strikes didn't go after tanks. They went after communications nodes. They didn't suppress the battlefield, they deleted it. As the war unfolded, Soviet analysts raced to catch up. Surveillance satellites were redirected. SIGINT stations in the Caucasus were tasked with monitoring AWACS signals. Field agents in Jordan and Syria were told to get close to coalition planning cells. But it was too late. The war was unfolding faster than Soviet intelligence could understand it. Inside a bunker near Moscow, one KGB general slammed a dossier onto a metal desk and spat the words, "We counted their bombs. We did not count their mines." Perhaps the most damning realization was this: there had been no deception. The U.S. hadn't hidden their capabilities. They had demonstrated them openly. In exercises, in briefings, even in trade shows. But the Soviets never believed those systems would work in real war, certainly not in a massive campaign against an entrenched military. So they didn't prepare. They didn't adapt. And when the moment came, they were watching a war built on 1,000 details they had ignored. This wasn't just a tactical loss. It was an intelligence collapse. And it meant that everything the Soviet Union had planned for, from Europe to Central Asia, was now based on assumptions that had already been proven false. In the end, it wasn't that Soviet intelligence couldn't see the future. It was that they saw it and refused to believe it. Desert Storm was not just a war. It was the unveiling of a machine that didn't look like anything the Soviets had prepared for because it wasn't built to be seen on satellite photos or measured in tank battalions or artillery brigades. It was built in wires, signals, algorithms, and timing. And when it came online, the Iraqi army trained in Soviet doctrine ceased to function. The true American system was integration, not just superior planes or bombs, but the fusion of sensors, shooters, decision-makers, and software into a single, high-speed strike web. From orbiting satellites to pilots in cockpits to battlefield commanders in desert tents, information flowed faster than any enemy could react. At its core was air-land battle, but matured, evolved. It began with space-based intelligence satellites pinpointing enemy logistics and troop concentrations in near real time. Then came AWACS aircraft, flying command centers that monitored every airborne target across the theater. J-STARS tracked ground movements, relaying vector updates as they happened. EA-6B prowlers and other electronic warfare platforms jammed, blinded, and confused whatever defenses remained. Every bomb wasn't just smart, it was informed. Phone 117 seconds struck. Targets selected minutes earlier based on intercepted communications. Tomahawk cruise missiles were updated mid-flight via satellite uplink. Ground troops, when they finally moved, had pre-marked paths cleared by precision strikes days before, and all of it was synchronized. Soviet doctrine expected friction, losses, misfires. That's why it planned in depth so that the front could absorb failure. But the U.S. system wasn't designed to absorb failure. It was designed to eliminate the possibility of it. Take the F-111 strike packages. They flew low, used terrain-following radar, struck multiple targets across Iraq's western desert, and returned before defenders even organized a response. Each mission was part of a chain, feeding intelligence to the next wave. When a radar came online, it was instantly triangulated and destroyed. No second chance. No adaptation time. This wasn't combined arms. This was composed warfare, a network of kill chains with no center, no pause, no vulnerability. Even more disruptive was command doctrine. U.S. planners delegated initiative downward. Pilots, captains, even junior officers had decision-making autonomy. Soviet doctrine demanded strict control from central command. But that model couldn't survive when communications were the first targets eliminated. The Americans knew this, so they hunted not divisions, but bandwidth. not soldiers, but frequencies. In doing so, they didn't just outfight the Iraqi army, they deactivated it. In a post-war debrief, one Pentagon analyst summarized it best. "We didn't defeat their forces. We disconnected them." That disconnection was the war's true weapon, not stealth, not firepower, architecture. A system that made everything the Soviets had built not just vulnerable, but irrelevant. And in the briefing rooms of Moscow, as this became clear, the reaction was not anger, it was fear, because they knew this wasn't just the next war, it was the last war they were prepared to fight, and it was already over. By February 1991, the ground war began, and for the Soviet command watching from Moscow, this was supposed to be the moment of truth. For weeks, they had rationalized the air campaign's devastation. They blamed Iraq's incompetence, their own outdated equipment, the softness of Arab troops. But when ground forces met steel against steel, the myth was that Soviet-style mechanized doctrine would finally assert itself. Instead, it unraveled in 100 hours. That's how long it took for the U.S. and coalition armored thrusts to dismantle Iraq's defenses, crush the Republican Guard, and overrun hardened positions that had been years in the making. 4 days. One of the largest tank forces outside of the USSR gone. This was the humiliation battle. The T-72, once the pride of Soviet export armor, was supposed to outmatch anything NATO fielded. But in the desert, the myth bled out through blown hatches and turret carcasses. Abrams tanks killed at ranges of 2,000, 500, 3,000 meters distances at which the T-72 couldn't even return fire. Most Iraqi crews never saw what hit them. Thermal sights turned night into day. GPS navigation allowed American forces to execute precise flanking maneuvers across open terrain. Communications networks synchronized movement across kilometers. Every Iraqi defensive belt crumbled not from frontal attack but from dislocation. It wasn't brute force. It was intellectual violence. And the most devastating blows came not from the battlefield, but from television. CNN aired the destruction live. The world saw burning Soviet tanks, saw captured Iraqi officers in Soviet-style uniforms, saw American helicopters hunting convoys in infrared like predators tracking prey. The U.S. didn't just win the war, they broadcast the defeat. And in that broadcast was the final humiliation. The Soviet Union, long the sponsor of wars of national liberation, the exporter of revolution, the patron of Ba'athist militarism, had created a system now collapsing under its own assumptions. Their weapons didn't work, their doctrine didn't work, and worst of all, their worldview no longer worked. In classified meetings, Soviet generals asked whether NATO would try the same on Warsaw Pact nations. In whispered corridors of the KGB, some wondered aloud if the United States would one day dismantle the USSR without firing a shot simply by showing the future on screen. Iraq's defeat wasn't just a military failure, it was a theological one, because if the Soviets couldn't defend their own doctrine on borrowed ground, what made them think it would survive on their own? In the final hours of Desert Storm, Soviet officers no longer questioned what happened. They questioned what hadn't happened yet, and what would be left when it did. Desert Storm ended on the 28th of February, 1991. The ground war had lasted only 4 days, the air campaign just over a month. In military terms, it was the most efficient campaign in modern history. But in Moscow, the consequences went far deeper than the battlefield. This was the moment Soviet leaders realized the Cold War was lost, and not just politically. Strategically, the United States had proven that mass mobilization was obsolete, that precision, speed, and coordination could achieve in days what once took years of blood and attrition. It wasn't just about weapons, it was about thinking. The Soviet General Staff, long obsessed with counting tanks and measuring brigade widths, found themselves staring at a war that could not be measured by tonnage or firepower. The entire conflict had been orchestrated by systems of targeting, real-time surveillance, and command autonomy that had no counterpart in Soviet doctrine. Ideologically, it was even worse. For decades, the Soviet Union had insisted that socialism could produce military parity, if not superiority, through centralized planning and state-driven science. They built massive defense industries, trained generations of officers, and exported military aid to regimes across the globe to prove it. But now, the global audience had seen the truth. American capitalism didn't just produce consumer goods. It produced machines of war that functioned better, faster, and smarter than anything the planned economy could rival. And those machines were wielded not by elites, but by enlisted volunteers, citizen soldiers executing mission orders with autonomy and precision. It was the final ideological break. Everything the Soviet system promised, technological progress, strategic vision, ideological superiority, had just been discredited in 100 hours of open desert. The humiliation was so profound that Soviet television barely covered the war's end. In internal sessions, military officials tried to spin it, that Iraq had been too isolated, that the U.S. wouldn't dare try the same against a true peer adversary, that the Red Army still had depth, but the collapse was already spreading. In Eastern Europe, former Warsaw Pact states took note. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, already trembling from the fall of the Berlin Wall, now saw the future in infrared. If America could do that to Iraq, they could do it to anyone. Even Soviet citizens, watching glimpses of the war on foreign broadcasts, began to question their place in the world. Not just economically, but militarily, existentially. The Red Army was no longer feared. It was bypassed. By March 1991, Soviet reformers within the Ministry of Defense began proposing what had once been unthinkable: disbandment of armored divisions, scaling back conscription, reorganizing around smaller, more agile units. But there was no time. By the end of the year, the Soviet Union would no longer exist. Desert Storm hadn't caused that collapse, but it had revealed it. Like a surgeon's scalpel, the war had exposed the rot beneath the muscle. Strategic decay, doctrinal rigidity, ideological exhaustion. And when the blade struck, there was no defense. Because the real war was never against tanks or soldiers. It was against the very idea that they were still enough. In the decades that followed, the world moved on. The Soviet Union dissolved. NATO expanded. New wars emerged in new theaters. But for military historians, planners, and analysts, Desert Storm never ended. Because in those 42 days, the Cold War's final chapter was written not in Berlin or in missile silos, but in the skies over Baghdad and the deserts of Kuwait. Soviet command had watched the future unfold, and it had terrified them. The ghost of that terror remains. In Russian military academies today, Desert Storm is studied with a quiet reverence, not for its tactics, but for its implications. It exposed the fragility of empires built on size instead of speed, on doctrine instead of adaptation. It showed that a war could be over before it began, if the right systems were in place and the wrong assumptions held too tightly. The United States never fired a shot at Moscow. They didn't need to. They dismantled Soviet credibility with radar pulses, satellite links, and 2,000-pound bombs that struck with surgical precision. The lesson lingers like a shadow, that the battlefield is no longer a place, but a network. That wars are won not by killing armies, but by removing the ability to command them. And for every regime still holding on to outdated doctrine, still building armies like it's 1,980, the ghost of the Cold War waits, silent, watching, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating defeat is the one you watch happen to someone else, and realize it could have been you.